This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Chapter 12. It must have been close on to 1 o'clock when we got below the island at last, and the raft did seem to go mighty slow. If a boat was to come along, we was going to take to the canoe and break for the Illinois shore, and it was well a boat didn't come, for we hadn't ever thought to put the gun in the canoe, or a fishing line, or anything to eat. We was in rather too much of a sweat to think of so many things. It warn't good judgment to put everything on the raft. If the men went to the island, I just expect they found the campfire I built and watched it all night for Jim to come. Anyways, they stayed away from us, and if my building the fire never fooled them, it warn't no fault of mine. I played it as low down on them as I could. When the first streak of day began to show, we tied up to a towhead in a big bend on the Illinois side, and hacked off cottonwood branches with a hatchet, and covered up the raft with them so she looked like there had been a cave-in the bank there. A towhead is a sandbar that has cottonwoods on it as thick as harrow teeth. We had mountains on the Missouri shore, and heavy timber on the Illinois side, and the channel was down the Missouri shore at that place, so we warn't afraid of anybody running across us. We laid there all day, and watched the rafts and steamboats spin down the Missouri shore, and up-bound steamboats fought the big river in the middle. I told Jim all about the time I had jabbering with that woman, and Jim said she was a smart one, and if she was to start after us herself, she wouldn't set down and watch a campfire. No, sir, she'd fetch a dog. Well, then, I said, why couldn't she tell her husband to fetch a dog? Jim said he bet she did think of it by the time the men were ready to start, and he believed they must have gone uptown to get a dog, and so they lost all that time, or else we wouldn't be here on the towhead 16 or 17 mile below the village. No, indeedy, we would be in that same old town again. So I said I didn't care what was the reason they didn't get us, as long as they didn't. When it was beginning to come on dark, we poked our heads out of the cottonwood thicket and looked up and down and across. Nothing in sight. So Jim took up some of the top planks of the raft and built a snug wigwam to get under in blazing weather and rainy, and to keep the things dry. Jim made a floor for the wigwam and raised it a foot or more above the level of the raft, so now the blankets and all the traps was out of reach of steamboat waves. Right in the middle of the wigwam we made a layer of dirt about 5 or 6 inches deep, with a frame around it for to hold it to its place. This was to build a fire on in sloppy weather or chilly. The wigwam would keep it from being seen. We made an extra steering oar, too, because one of the others might get broke on a snag or something. We fixed up a short forked stick to hold the old lantern on, because we must always light the lantern whenever we see a steamboat coming downstream, to keep from getting run over. But we wouldn't have to light it for upstream boats unless we see we was in what they call a crossing, for the river was pretty high yet, very low banks being still a little under water, so upbound boats didn't always run the channel, but hunted easy water. This second night we run between 7 and 8 hours, with a current that was making over 4 mile an hour. We catched fish and talked, and we took a swim now and then to keep off sleepiness. It was kind of solemn, drifting down the big, still river, laying on our backs looking up at the stars, and we didn't ever feel like talking loud, and it warn't often that we laughed, only a little kind of a low chuckle. We had mighty good weather as a general thing, and nothing ever happened to us at all, that night, nor the next, nor the next. Every night we passed towns, some of them away up on black hillsides. Nothing but just a shiny bed of lights. Not a house could you see. The 5th night we passed St. Louis, and it was like the whole world lit up. In St. Petersburg they used to say there was 20 or 30,000 people in St. Louis, but I never believed it till I see that wonderful spread of lights at 2 o'clock that still night. There warn't a sound there. Everybody was asleep. Every night now I used to slip ashore towards 10 o'clock at some little village, and buy 10 or 15 cents worth of meal or bacon or other stuff to eat. Sometimes I lifted a chicken that warn't roostin' comfortable, took him along. Pap always said, "Take a chicken when you get a chance, because if you don't want him yourself, you can easy find somebody that does, and a good deed ain't ever forgot." I never see Pap when he didn't want the chicken hisself, but that is what he used to say anyway. Mornings before daylight I slipped into cornfields and borrowed a watermelon, or a mushmelon, or a pumpkin, or some new corn, or things of that kind. Pap always said it warn't no harm to borrow things if you was meaning to pay them back some time, but the widow said it warn't anything but a soft name for stealing, and no decent body would do it. Jim said he reckoned the widow was partly right, and Pap was partly right, so the best way would be for us to pick out 2 or 3 things from the list and say we wouldn't borrow them any more. Then he reckoned it wouldn't be no harm to borrow the others. So we talked it over all one night, driftin' along down the river, trying to make up our minds whether to drop the watermelons or the cantaloupes or the mushmelons or what. But towards daylight we got it all settled satisfactory, and concluded to drop crab apples and persimmons. We weren't feeling just right before that, but it was all comfortable now. I was glad the way it come out, too, because crab apples ain't ever good, and the persimmons wouldn't be ripe for 2 or 3 months yet. We shot a waterfowl now and then that got up too early in the morning or didn't go to bed early enough in the evening. Take it all around, we lived pretty high. The 5th night below St. Louis we had a big storm after midnight, with a power of thunder and lightning, and the rain poured down in a solid sheet. We stayed in the wigwam and let the raft take care of itself. When the lightning glared out, we could see a big straight river ahead, and high rocky bluffs on both sides. By and by says I, "Hello, Jim, look ye yonder." It was a steamboat that had killed herself on a rock. We was drifting straight down for her. The lightning showed her very distinct. She was leaning over, with part of her upper deck above water, and you could see every little chimbly guy clean and clear, and a chair by the big bell, with an old slouch hat hanging on the back of it when the flashes come. Well, it being away in the night and stormy and all so mysterious like, I felt just the way any other boy would have felt when I see that wreck layin' there so mournful and lonesome in the middle of the river. I wanted to get aboard of her and slink around a little and see what there was there. So I says, "Let's land on her, Jim." But Jim was dead against it at first. He says, "I don't want to go fool around no wrack. We's doin' blame well, and we better let blame well alone, as the good book says. Like as not, there's a watchman on that wreck." "Watchman your grandmother," I says. "There ain't nothin' to watch but the Texas and the pilot house, and do you reckon anybody's going to risk his life for a Texas and a pilot house such a night as this, when it's likely to break up and wash down the river any minute?" Jim couldn't say nothin' to that, so he didn't try. "And besides," I says, "we might borrow something worth having out of the captain's stateroom. Cigars, I bet you, and cost 5 cents apiece solid cash. Steamboat captains is always rich, and get $60 a month, and they don't care a cent what a thing costs, you know, long as they want it. Stick a candle in your pocket? I can't rest, Jim, till we give her a rummaging. Do you reckon Tom Sawyer would ever go buy this thing? Not for pie, he wouldn't. He'd call it an adventure, that's what he'd call it, and he'd land on that wreck if it was his last act. And wouldn't he throw style into it? Wouldn't he spread hisself nor nothin'? Why, you think it was Christopher Columbus discoverin' Kingdom Come. I wish Tom Sawyer was here." Jim he grumbled a little, but give in. He said we mustn't talk any more than we could help, and then talk mighty low. The lightning showed us the wreck again just in time, and we fetched the starboard derrick and made fast there. The deck was high out here. We went sneaking down the slope of it to larboard, in the dark, towards the Texas, feeling our way slow with our feet, and spreading our hands out to fend off the guys, for it was so dark we couldn't see no sign of them. Pretty soon we struck the forward end of the skylight and clumb on to it, and the next step fetched us in front of the captain's door, which was open, and by Jiminy, away down through the Texas hall we see a light, and all in the same second we seemed to hear low voices in yonder. Jim whispered and said he was feeling powerful sick, and told me to come along. I says all right, and was going to start for the raft, but just then I heard a voice wail out and say, "Oh, please don't, boys. I swear I won't ever tell." Another voice said pretty loud, "That's a lie, Jim Turner. You've acted this way before. You always want more'n your share of the truck, and you've always got it, too, because you've swore if you didn't you'd tell. But this time you said it just one time too many. You're the meanest, treacherousest hound in this country." By this time Jim was gone for the raft. I was just a-bilin' with curiosity, and I says to myself, Tom Sawyer wouldn't back out now, and so I won't either. I'm a-goin' to see what's goin' on here. So I dropped on my hands and knees in the little passage and crept aft in the dark till there warn't but one stateroom betwixt me and the cross hall of the Texas. Then in there I see a man stretched on the floor and tied hand and foot, and two men standing over him, and one of them had a dim lantern in his hand, and the other one had a pistol. This one kept pointing the pistol at the man's head on the floor and saying, "I'd like to, and I order to, a mean skunk." The man on the floor would shrivel up and say, "Oh, please don't, Bill. I ain't ever going to tell." And every time he said that, the man with the lantern would laugh and say, "'Deed you ain't. You never said no truer thing 'n that, you bet ye." And once he said, "Hear him beg, and yit if we hadn't got the best of him and tied him he'd 'a killed us both. And what for? Just for nothin'. Just because we stood on our rights. That's what for. But I lay you ain't goin' to threaten nobody any more, Jim Turner. Put up that pistol, Bill." Bill says, "I don't want to, Jake Packard. I'm a for killin' him, and didn't he kill old Hatfield just the same way? And don't he deserve it?" "But I don't want him killed, and I got my reasons for it." "Bless your heart for them words, Jake Packard. I'll never forget you long as I live," says the man on the floor, sort of blubberin'. Packard didn't take no notice of that, but hung up his lantern on a nail and started towards where I was there in the dark, and motioned Bill to come. I crawfished as fast as I could about 2 yards, but the boat slanted so I couldn't make very good time. So to keep from getting run over and catched, I crawled into a stateroom on the upper side. The man came a-pawing along in the dark, and when Packard got to my stateroom he says, "Here, come in here." And in he come, and Bill after him. But before they got in I was up in the upper berth, cornered, and sorry I come. Then they stood there with their hands on the ledge of the berth and talked. I couldn't see them, but I could tell where they was by the whiskey they'd been having. I was glad I didn't drink whiskey, but it wouldn't have made much difference anyway, because most of the time they couldn't have treed me because I didn't breathe. I was too scared, and besides a body couldn't breathe and hear such talk. They talked low and earnest. Bill wanted to kill Turner. He says,
He said he'll tell, and he will. If we was to give both our shares to him now, it wouldn't make no difference after the row and the way we've served him. Shore's you're born, he'll turn state's evidence. Now you hear me. I'm for putting him out of his troubles."
"So am I," says Packard, very quiet.
"Blame it, I'd sort of begun to think you wasn't. Well, then, that's all right. Let's go and do it."
"Hold on a minute. I hain't had my say yet. You listen to me. Shootin's good, but there's quieter ways of the thing's got to be done. But what I say is this: it ain't good sense to go courtin' round after a halter if you can git at what you're up to in some way that's just as good and at the same time don't bring you into no risks. Ain't that so?"
"You bet it is. But how you goin' to manage it this time?"
"Well, my idea is this: we'll rustle round, gather up whatever pickin's we've overlooked in the staterooms, and shove for shore and hide the truck. Then we'll wait. Now I say it ain't goin' to be more'n 2 hours before this wreck breaks up and washes off down the river. See? He'll be drownded, and won't have nobody to blame for it but his own self. I reckon that's a considerable sight better'n killin' of him. I'm unfavorable to killin' a man as long as you can git around it. It ain't good sense. It ain't good morals. Ain't I right?"
"Yes, I reckon you are. But s'pose she don't break up and wash off?"
"Well, we can wait the 2 hours anyway and see, can't we?"
"All right, then. Come along."
So they started, and I lit out, all in a cold sweat, and scrambled forward. It was dark as pitch there, but I said in a kind of coarse whisper, "Jim," and he answered up right at my elbow with a sort of a moan, and I says, "Quick, Jim, it ain't no time for foolin' around and moanin'. There's a gang of murderers in yonder, and if we don't hunt up their boat and set her driftin' down the river so these fellers can't get away from the wreck, there's one of 'em goin' to be in a bad fix. And if we find their boat we can put all of 'em in a bad fix, for the sheriff will get 'em. Quick, hurry. I'll hunt the labboard side, you hunt the starboard. You start at the raft and—" "Oh, my lordy, lordy! Raft! There ain't no raft no more. She done broke loose and gone. Oh, and here we is." End of chapter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain, Chapter 13. Well, I catched my breath and most fainted. Shut up on a wreck with such a gang as that. But it warn't no time to be sentimentering. We've got to find that boat now. Had to have it for ourselves. So we went a quaking and shaking down the starboard side, and slow work it was, too. Seemed a week before we got to the stern. No sign of a boat. Jim said he didn't believe he could go any further. So scared he hadn't hardly any strength left, he said. But I said, come on. If we get left on this wreck, we are in a fix, sure. So on we prowled again. We struck for the stern of the Texas and found it, and then scrabbled along forwards on the skylight, hanging on from shutter to shutter, for the edge of the skylight was in the water. When we got pretty close to the cross-hall door, there was the skiff, sure enough. I could just barely see her. I felt ever so thankful. In another second I would have been aboard of her, but just then the door opened. One of the men stuck his head out only about a couple of foot from me, and I thought I was gone. But he jerked it in again and says,
"Heave that blame lantern out of sight, Bill."
He flung a bag of something into the boat, and then got in hisself and sat down. It was Packard. Then Bill he come out and got in. Packard says in a low voice,
"All ready. Shove off."
I couldn't hardly hang on to the shutters, I was so weak. But Bill says,
Hold on. You go through 'em?
"No, didn't you?"
No. He's got his share of the cash yet.
"Well, then, come along. No use to take truck and leave money."
Say, won't he suspicion what we're up to?
"Maybe he won't, but we got to have it anyway. Come along." So they got out and went in. The door slammed to because it was on the careen's side, and in a half second I was in the boat, and Jim come tumbling after me. I out with my knife and cut the rope, and away we went. We didn't touch an oar, and we didn't speak nor whisper, nor hardly even breathe. We went gliding swift along, dead silent, past the tip of the paddle box and past the stern. Then in a second or two more we was 100 yards below the wreck, and the darkness soaked her up, every last sign of her, and we was safe and knowed it. When we was 300 or 400 yards downstream we see the lantern show like a little spark at the Texas door for a second, and we knowed by that the rascals had missed their boat and was beginning to understand that they was in just as much trouble now as Jim Turner was. Then Jim manned the oars, and we took out after the raft. Now was the first time that I begun to worry about the men. I reckoned I hadn't had time to before. I begun to think how dreadful it was, even for murderers, to be in such a fix. I says to myself, there ain't no tellin' but I might come to be a murderer myself yet, and then how would I like it? So says I to Jim, "First light we see we'll land 100 yards below it or above it, in a place where it'll be a good hiding place for you and the skiff, and then I'll go and fix up some kind of a yarn and get somebody to go for that gang and get them out of their scrape, so they can be hung when their time comes." But that idea was a failure, for pretty soon it begun to storm again, and this time worse than ever. The rain poured down, and never a light showed. Everybody in bed, I reckon. We boomed along down the river, watching for lights and watching for our raft. After a long time the rain let up, but the clouds stayed, and the lightning kept whimpering, and by a flash showed us a black thing ahead, floating, and we made for it. It was the raft, and mighty glad was we to get aboard of it again. We seen a light now away down to the right on shore, so I said I would go for it. The skiff was half full of plunder which that gang had stole there on the wreck. We hustled it onto the raft in a pile, and I told Jim to float along down and show a light when we judged he had gone about 2 mile, and keep it burning till I come. Then I manned my oars and shoved for the light. As I got down towards it 3 or 4 more showed, up on a hillside. It was a village. I closed in above the shore light and laid on my oars and floated. As I went by I see it was a lantern hanging on the jackstaff of a double-hull ferryboat. I skimmed around for the watchman, a-wondering whereabouts he slept, and by I found him roosting on the bitts forward, with his head down between his knees. I gave his shoulder 2 or 3 little shoves and begun to cry. He stirred up in a kind of startlish way, but when he see it was only me, he took a good gap and stretch, and then he says, "Hello, what's up? Don't cry, bub. What's the trouble?" I says, "Pap and Mam and Sis and—" Then I broke down. He says, "Oh, dang it all, don't take on so. We all has to have our troubles, and this'll come out all right. What's the matter with 'em?" "They're... Are you the watchman of the boat?" "Yes," he says, kind of pretty well satisfied like. "I'm the captain and the owner and the mate and the pilot and watchman and head deckhand. Sometimes I'm the freight and passengers. I ain't as rich as old Jim Hornbeck, and I can't be so blame generous and good to Tom, Dick, and Harry as what he is, and slam around money the way he does. But I've told him many a time I wouldn't trade places with him. For, says I, a sailor's life's a life for me, and I'm derned if I'd live 2 mile out of town, where there ain't nothin' ever goin' on,
not for all his spondulics, and is much more on top of it. Says I broke in and says, "They're in an awful peck of trouble, and—" "Who is?" "Why, Pap and Mam and Sis and Miss Hooker, and if you'd take your ferry boat and go up there—" "Up where? Where are they?" "On the wreck." "What wreck?" "Why, there ain't but one." "What? You don't mean the Walter Scott?" "Yes." "Good land! What are they doing there, for gracious sakes?" "Well, they didn't go there a purpose." "I bet they didn't. Why, great goodness, there ain't no chance for 'em if they don't get off mighty quick. Why, how in the nation did they ever get into such a scrape?" "Easy enough. Miss Hooker was a visitin' up there to the town." "Yes, Booth's Landing. Go on." "She was a visitin' there at Booth's Landing, and just in the edge of the evenin' she started over with a nigger woman in the horse ferry to stay all night at her friend's house, Miss what you may call her, I disremember her name, and they lost their steerin' oar and swung around and went a floatin' down stern first, about 2 mile, and saddle bagsed on the wreck, and the ferryman and the nigger woman and the horses were all lost, but Miss Hooker she made a grab and got aboard the wreck. Well, about an hour after dark we come along down in our tradin' scow, and it was so dark we didn't notice the wreck till we was right on it, and so we saddle bagsed, and all of us was saved but Bill Whipple, and oh, he was the best creature. I most wished it'd been me, I do." "My George! It's the beatin'est thing I ever struck. And then what did you all do?" "Well, we hollered and took on, but it's so wide there we couldn't make nobody hear. So p'raps it's somebody got to get ashore and get help somehow. I was the only one that could swim, so I made a dash for it, and Miss Hooker she said if I didn't strike help sooner, come here and hunt up her uncle, and he'd fix the thing. I made the land about a mile below, and been fooling along ever since, trying to get people to do something, but they said, 'What, in such a night and such a current? There ain't no sense in it. Go for the steam ferry.' Now if you'll go and—" "By Jackson, I'd like to, and blame it, I don't know but I will. But who in the dingnation's a goin' to pay for it? Do you reckon your pap—" "Why, that's all right. Miss Hooker she told me, particular, that her Uncle Hornback—" "Great guns! Is he her uncle? Looky here, you break for that light over yonder way, and turn out west when you git there, and about a quarter of a mile out you'll come to the tavern. Tell 'em to dart you out to Jim Hornback's, and he'll foot the bill. And don't you fool around any, because he'll want to know the news. Tell him I'll have his niece all safe before he can get to town. Hump yourself now. I'm a goin' up around the corner here to roust out my engineer." I struck for the light, but as soon as he turned the corner I went back and got into my skiff and bailed her out, and then pulled up shore in the easy water about 600 yards, and tucked myself in among some wood boats, for I couldn't rest easy till I could see the ferry boat start. But take it all around, I was feelin' ruther comfortable on accounts of takin' all this trouble for that gang, for not many would have done it. I wished the widow knowed about it. I judged she would be proud of me for helpin' these rapscallions, because rapscallions and deadbeats is the kind the widow and good people takes the most interest in. Well, before long here comes the wreck, dim and dusky, slidin' along down. A kind of cold shiver went through me, and then I struck out for her. She was very deep, and I seen in a minute there warn't much chance for anybody bein' alive in her. I pulled all around her and hollered a little, but there wasn't any answer. All dead still. I felt a little bit heavy-hearted about the gang, but not much, for I reckon if they could stand it I could. Then here comes the ferry boat, so I shoved for the middle of the river on a long downstream slant, and when I judged I was out of eye reach I laid on my oars, and looked back and see her go and smell around the wreck for Miss Hooker's remainders, because the captain would know her Uncle Hornback would want them. And then pretty soon the ferry boat give it up and went for the shore, and I laid into my work and went a boomin' down the river.
It did seem a powerful long time before Jim's light showed up, and when it did show it looked like it was 1,000 mile off. By the time I got there the sky was beginning to get a little gray in the east, so we struck for an island and hid the raft and sunk the skiff, and turned in and slept like dead people. End of chapter.